Well, this is a new book of epigrams, and it's called The Twoness of Oneness. The Twoness of Oneness. What do I mean by that? People like to say, they feel, a oneness with nature. And sometimes when we're in love, we feel as though we're at one with the other. But seldom do these sentiments last for long. And then we're aware again of what's distinctively separate about us in our lives, whether we want it to be that way or not. In ancient mythology, humans were said to be complete and whole in themselves, having both a male and a female aspect. We're not there anymore. We're separate. Anyway, so the Twoness of Oneness. Here's the epigram that opens the book. What am I up to in this? So, old man, difficult, complaining, dying, unbecoming. So I'm playing on the word unbecoming. Something's unbecoming, and it's literally unbecoming. Remembering being at a party and meeting a famous astronomer, I asked him what would happen after the end of the universe. He had probably heard this kind of question many times before and was tired of it, but I was just making small talk. And I said to him, would there be souls after the end of the universe? And he said to me, I thought condescendingly, he said, have you ever seen a soul? And I said, no, of course I haven't. And he looked as though he thought the conversation would end there. And I said, well, will there be books after the end of the universe? Meaning that I didn't think he knew any better than I what would happen after the end of the universe. Sometimes the epigrams are about the limits of our knowledge, or that we don't acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. The man who could do almost anything for himself, French kissing her. What am I up to with that? Well, how did I get to there? I guess I was thinking about kissing and what is kissing and why do we kiss? And they say that kissing has to do maybe with the way people used to masticate food and pass it on to the young, chewing the food and then passing it on, so it kind of developed our oral appetites. My mind kind of likes to look at first causes. How do we get to be the way we are? Why do we kiss? And then I like the idea of someone being independent, but of course there are some things you can't do just for yourself. The man who could do almost anything for himself, French kissing her. I guess there, what I'm playing with is the idea of breaking promises. We know that's a bad thing, but what about the promises we don't even offer? So, promises, comparative price check, not kept versus not made. Old age, farewells in progress, some of them not articulated. Oneself in the mirror, person to whom you must be sure to say goodbye. That one comes, I think, from my sense that as you get older, you let some things slip away and you know you're not going to say goodbye to everyone. You're just going to kind of let them go. It's too many goodbyes to say, perhaps. Anyway, that's where that came from. Sometimes the epigrams are just wicked, even at one's own expense. Here's one. Envisioning previous lovers in her, oneself retrospectively, odd man out. So, I don't think there are any lovers who have ever not speculated on their beloved, what he or she was doing before they met. And it's my nature to go at these uncomfortable thoughts and feelings and at least tease myself about their qualities. Envisioning previous lovers in her, oneself retrospectively, odd man out. And again, the other thing I'm doing here is we take the idiom, he's odd man out, and in this case, he's really odd. But of course, his oddness is just like all the rest of us, kind of. That's part of the epigram's argument, is that we block out a lot of things. We make ourselves blind to a lot of what we do or what others do. Anyway. We all know what lechers are. Lecher, from the French, to lick. A man immoderately given to sexual indulgence, as characterized by the immoderately envious. So for me, what's working in that epigram is the etymology of the word lecher, to lick. Who would have thought that? So I love to get at the root meanings of words. To me, that illuminates their full force that usually we're ignorant of or is suppressed. Okay, so to begin with, to find the meaning, the root of the word lecher knocks me out. And then I look up the dictionary definition, a man immoderately given to sexual indulgence. But who would have that opinion of another man, of another human being, to say he's immoderately given to sexual indulgence? That makes it sound bad. So when I hear that definition, I start thinking, what's the point of view of the person who's defining another human being that way? And I would say it's envy. So then I try to make some wordplay. Lecher, from the French, to lick. A man immoderately given to sexual indulgence, as characterized by the immoderately envious. In my earlier books of epigrams, I had essays that accompanied the books to try to explain what I thought I was up to, but also to offer a kind of a counterpoint in extended prose to what the epigrams were doing. So I was up to two things with those essays. I wanted to explain what my motives were and my strategies, but also I wanted to show the difference between a more extended form and something very small. So here it is. What made him do it again? All's well that ends well. A good time was had by all, happily ever after. August 2007, age 63. The writer's back from Paris. Édition Gallimard has acquired the rights to his novel, The Beholder, and he's completed a final draft of his new book, Brief Nudity. Meanwhile, young Bikram has entered his life, is suddenly in residence. Unexpected miracle. Though he thought he'd be traveling, Thailand maybe, New York City, she's preparing for her PhD orals, so he's staying close to home. Making room for her in the cottage and the garage library after years of living alone, among other things, he starts culling books, setting box after box out on the curb, watching footprints of his path as a writer vanish. In the process, he encounters once again his library's sex and death alphabets and the adjoining shelves of the epigrammatic or books unveiling aspects of character. Malcolm de Chazal, Harold Brodkey, Machiavelli, Pauline Réage, Adam Phillips, Montaigne, Laura Kipnis, Issa, Freud, Kawabata, Tony Bentley, Pessoa, Irving Goffman. Titles: Humiliation, The Bed Trick, Advice on Dying, Objects of Desire, Night Games, Arousal. Bringing 5 or 6 books at a time into the cottage to his study, very selective reading, trolling for what will provoke him to ponder, react, elaborate. And what's on his mind? Passion, etymology, aging, love, self-deception, lives in art, idioms, death, wordplay. And the medium in which he'll work? Once again, the epigrammatic. His book, Truth Be Told, New and Collected Pre-Mortems, in 2005, it turns out that had left him hungry for still more. Such an odd form, the epigrammatic, to strive for compression, verbal surprise, paradox, shock, rueful acknowledgement, or revelation of moral blindness may bring out one's own oddness, make one too determined to implicate the reader, the writer, through or at the risk of hyperbole, reductionism, unfairness. Doing so with dictionaries close at hand, focusing laser-like on a single line, erotics of the irreducible, or working on a tiny canvas like the artist who painted imaginary postage stamps, or hounding an emotion, backtracking all the way back to root meaning, concealed impulse, precluding or preempting response. Such a pursuit requiring silence, writing time, reading time, something very old school about it, pre-modern, connecting across centuries and tongues to say Marshall, La Rochefoucauld, Lichtenberg, blood brothers, and bad boys too. Frequently asked questions. Does the epigramist consider nothing sacred? Is he without scruple or restraint? Answer: ideally, yes. Nonetheless, the utterances of some kind souls can leave one almost speechless. The Dalai Lama, for instance, writes that when a person has achieved a high level of practice in motivation and wisdom, even the joining of the 2 sex organs does not detract from the maintenance of pure behavior. Oh, picture the epigramist at his desk, mulling this vision of realizing the, quote, emptiness of inherent existence, wishing he had been able to quote the Dalai Lama to reluctant sweethearts when he was a teenager. The thought of just which ones might have tumbled to such suasion, making him grin. But oops, there's a knock, knock, knock on the door. Become making her entrance, coming to sit on the writer's lap, to be read to listen to the latest calumny in this text. Beautiful girl, art and life.
Beautiful, Tommy.
The thing about the Dalai Lama?
Yeah.
Isn't that funny? Okay, where was I? Okay, so poems are inherently self-aggrandizing. There's all that white space. So they're made to seem important, and my feeling is they better be good. Sometimes I find that poets play the poet too much, and I have a bone to pick with them. Here's one. The sincerely confessional poet at 75, lips still buttoned about career-long dissembling, oh, always so affable, or insider award trading, or about giving the wife beloved dedicatee, venereal microbes bestowed by one muse or another. The confessional poet does, however, publish a new and selected poems with a sonnet about passing gas. 14 more lines of smoke blown up the reader's nether end. Grave pending, it's all asses to asses. And of course, you're getting the play of ashes to ashes. Anyway, shame on me. I can't help myself. I'm skipping some. Here's one. So the epigrams deal with hypocrisy, with wordplay, with death, and with sex. Here's one. And there I'm playing with the several things. One is how much it takes to convince us someone has betrayed us. And the other is I'm playing with the phrase, seeing is believing, and that gets me to smelling is disbelieving. Anyway. What I like about what's going on there is to try to get at the components of anger. And anger's, of course, got many different aspects to it. And maybe one day I was thwarted in my effort to grasp something and I felt angry. So I tried to examine my own motives. That's part of what epigrams are. If the epigramist does not implicate himself, he's not doing his job. What I don't like is people who write things about other people as if they somehow stood aside, apart from their subject. The sort of boyfriend of the woman I started sleeping with, farther along we got, farther along they got. How did I get to that? Well, when you're dating people, nearly everything is a mystery. It's kind of a remarkable thing in our culture that you could be having sex with someone and know very little about them. And of course, they're telling you stories from the start about who they are and what's going on in their lives. So the sort of boyfriend of the woman I started sleeping with, farther along we got, farther along they got. Of course, like everyone, I'm living in the real world. And I have an effort to comment on world events. And in particular, on the horror of the Bush administration. But how do you do that, you see, without sounding like a propagandist? How do you do it and make language still stay alive? So here's one effort at it. They had such noble convictions about avoiding the war in Vietnam. Too bad that they lost that wonderful conviction. Or so I think. I guess part of the thing about Bush and Cheney is there's no shame. That's one of the things that makes one so upset with them. It's just no shame at all. A lot of the epigrams are playing with our easy assertions about what's good and bad. Here's one. Narcissists envied, too lucky in love. Narcissists envied, too lucky in love. See, we view the word narcissist as a pejorative. We think we know what a narcissist is and what's the matter with him or her. But maybe actually our emotion about them is that they've found someone to love and they're happy in it. What if that's the case? What would it say about us? And I think that's part of what the epigrams are trying to do, is to shake one's easy assumptions about what's good and bad, how things work. We tell ourselves a lot of stories and not all of them are true. The Spanish conquistadors slaughtered the Indians of the Caribbean for being, among other things, sodomites. Opposites attract.
What made you think of that one?
I was reading something about the the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean, and that was apparently one of the phrases they used to impugn the Indians for being subhuman, though the Spanish at that time had about 1,000 words for fucking males fucking other males in the ass. I mean, so, Jesus Christ, you know. Here comes Vic in the back door, by the way.
Hey, Vic.
Yes.
You understand what Tom's up to?
No.
Not even in bed.
No.
Vic, you know, is the occasion for this book of epigrams, because since I had to stay home while she was studying for her PhD orals, I had nothing to do, so I thought, oh well, what shall I do? I'll write another book. So she's the proximate cause. Poor thing.
Do I get all the credit?
Yeah, you get and all the money. That reminds me of a man who circumcised elephants. The pay was bad, but the tips were huge. The royalties for a book of epigrams aren't going to be huge, baby. Now I tell you. Yeah. Sometimes I'm counting on the blank page to carry weight that the spoken phrase would not. What I'm up to there is the words themselves in that case. There's nothing complicated in the syntax or the meaning, but the white space I'm hoping will force the reader to let it reverberate, the phrase, and to see, you know, what could I possibly mean by this, and I'm hoping it will be subversive. Well, what would be happening if after a year of marriage a guy is putting on weight? The French writer Jabez, who was an Egyptian Jew living in Paris, he argued that the white space is more important than the text itself. And that's an interesting idea. So one of the things the epigrammist has to play with is the white space. And so in this short one, I'm not playing with linguistic tricks or compression, really. I'm putting out a simple sentence and hoping it reverberates in complicated ways. A lot of what's going on in the epigrams is making the reader complete the thought or the sentiment or connect the dots. Here's one. Are you waiting to die? Suicides as control freaks. Now, two things are on my mind about that. One is there's this weird moment at which you suddenly realize you're really going to die. I don't mean that you didn't always know that or make reference to it or acknowledge it in some abstract sense. But there does seem to be a line you cross where people are dropping like flies all around you and you actually realize you have 10 or 15 or 17 or 19 years left to go. That's very odd. And then once you notice that you have only 15 or 20 years left, now you start dating everything from that ending, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm 20 now, meaning I was born 20 years ago. The arithmetic comes from a different vantage point. So in that sense, even if you're not actively waiting to die, you're waiting to die. And it amused me to think of suicides as people who are trying to change that passivity into something active. And the other thing that's going on for me in that is that we think of suicides as a bad thing. And maybe they are. But that maybe they are, for some people, an expression of a desire to control what we are otherwise helpless in the face of, which is our mortality. Okay. Sometimes, as I say, I'm both trying to get at a sentiment in an epigram, but also to coin a word or a phrase. So, at the buffet table of sexual pleasure, The masturbatrix helped herself. Well, a masturbator is a phrase we know well, but you know how you have a dominator and a dominatrix. So I thought, how about a masturbator and a masturbatrix, Trix. At the buffet table of sexual pleasure, the masturbatrix helped herself. And of course I have to make it a food thing so I can get in the thing, helping herself. That's my job. Sometimes I'm just hearing an idiom as if for the first time. Who gives a shit? Who gives a shit? We say it all the time. But maybe we shouldn't talk that way, even though I do a lot. Because I come from Boston, and as kids we talked a lot like that.
Implicating yourself here.
Well, I'm in a new relationship. I'm in a new relationship, and it's very passionate. And I've certainly been taking advantage of Vic where I can. And but there is that odd moment when you're kind of stunned with what you've achieved, and that made me think. And so here's what I came up with. Limbs intertwined, eyes glazed, orgasms achieved. The amnesiacs are unable to recall who, what, where, when, or why. The promises we make, I love to play with the promises we make so sincerely and our inability to live up to them. You know, what's going on there too is my own capacity for fidelity. When I read this to Vic, she said, "Is that about you?" And I was a little bit shocked, and I said, "Oh no, the epigrams are an effort at universality." But she read me right. And how unkind of her to do that. One of the things that interests me is how people seem to deny the inevitability of their death as they get older. Well, in that one, I'm saying that his failure to tackle what's really true is what the reader is left with, that the writer is ducking, dealing with what he should be addressing. At a certain point for a writer, for instance, to go back and write some more about his childhood is just dodging the issue. He's written enough usually about his childhood, and better to write about things that are getting more and more true. So here's a companion epigram for that one. Sometimes I'm just entranced with words and with their sounds, or I notice something about a word that I didn't notice before. Here's one. So, refuse and refuse are spelled the same, but they're pronounced differently. Why is that? So it goes like this. S's. Refuse, verb. Refuse, noun. That's all. Noun, adjective. Hard C, soft C. Rancor, rancid. Wow. You see, I would have never thought there was a relationship between the word rancor and the word rancid. And part of the reason I hadn't made that connection is because of the difference in the pronunciation of the C's in the two words. Noun, adjective, hard C, soft C, rancor, rancid. Well, to think of rancor and rancid together for me illuminates both words. Yeah, maybe for you too. Here's one. I was remembering my mother's dying and how I thought that in those months of her terminal illness, she'd want to explain some things or even apologize for some things to one or another of my siblings, and she didn't. And in my story about her in that period, I have her responding to what I'm writing, talking from the other side of the grave, criticizing my interpretation. I give my mother the last word. So that led me to this epigram. The dead, invisible, but not inaudible. And I'd like to think my mom would like this one a lot.
Who is your mother?
My mother, the late Norma Farber, was a poet who published maybe 35 books, beautiful books, poems and books for children that were really for adults, reading books to children. Very rich. She also had been a singer of lieder and opera, very famous at that as well, and an actress, and mother of 4 children, and wife of my dad, the very famous pathologist and cancer researcher, Sidney Farber. Here in my study, you know, I try to keep books that will provoke me when I'm writing the epigrams close at hand. And it's an odd array of kinds of things I'm pushing off against. I mean, over there is a book called Humiliation. And that's a no-brainer. That's of interest to me. When I first see a reference to a book with that title, I want to know what are the components of that emotion when we feel humiliated. What's really going on? What have we lost when we lose face, for instance? But any of these books that I've been working through, and these are just the most recent. For instance, here's a book, The Subtlety of Emotions, by an Israeli Ben Zeev. He's already said a few things, he's written a few things that really interest me, and I'm going to return to them. I'm going to try to play with them. One is, he's talking about the qualities by gender, emotional qualities, and he basically has said, I note, that males seem to be better at anger, pride, sexual desire, and contempt. Well, wow. I hadn't thought of that before, and I'm going to think about it. Anger, pride, sexual desire, and contempt. Men express those qualities more often than women do. Elsewhere he says, speaking of emotional pretenses, and he doesn't think pretenses are all bad. He thinks that we have a need for privacy that's just as important as many other needs, and that the pretenses are functional. But discussing the types of emotional pretenses, he says there are both veils and masks. Veils and masks. Wow. Well, I'm going to have to chew on that for a while. And then finally, he considers gossip a good thing. For him, gossip's not a pejorative. And he says the root of the word is not negative, but I have to look it up. So that's my next task, is to see if he's right. But all 3 of these ideas, you know, as I am scanning his book, I'm looking not just to read for pleasure, but to find things to provoke me. And like those words, veil and mask, that's just not a distinction I could have come up with on my own. And I hope to take it further, or to test it, and maybe get an epigram out of that. There's a book here called On Kissing, and it probably helped provoke me toward my epigram about French kissing, just to think about kissing. Here's Montaigne, the French writer, and you know, he was so good at talking about his own nature and the nature of others. Or a more contemporary writer, where did he go? Yes, Adam Phillips. And this is a collection of his called Monogamy, and they're not quite epigrams, but they're brief paragraphs catching the anomalies of monogamy. He's an awfully smart writer, and he's a psychoanalyst, and I've learned a lot from him. Very smart man. Well, the famous writer Walter Benjamin, German, living in Paris, a Jew, had to flee Paris when the German army came in World War II, before World War II, and occupied Paris. And he had to leave his library behind. And that's always made me very nervous, the idea of that, because these books they're not treasure in financial terms. They're treasure in terms of my thinking and how I got where I was going. And these are the tracks of my tears. So this is the epigram section, and there's some treasures here. The French, 20th century French writer Jules Renard, more Adam Phillips, a book on crying. Well, what are tears, exactly? Edmond Jabez, that Egyptian Jew I spoke of, who lived in France, his famous book, The Book of Questions. Machiavelli, that amazing student of political behavior. Martial, the ancient Roman and a great epigrammist. Lichtenberg, the German who wrote this wonderful epigram. Someone had irritated him and with a review of something he wrote, and he said, a book is a kind of a mirror. When a monkey looks in, an apostle does not look back out. Oh, books on lying, which is something we do quite a bit of. It seems to be part of our necessary nature. Malice, the tyranny of malice. And then below, books on dying and death. The tyranny of malice. I should take this out. So this, I better reread this. I think there's still treasure for me to find here. Okay, here's Guido Serenetti, Italian doctor. This book is The Silence of the Body. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing him, that when you perform cunnilingus on a man, you have to be careful because you're immersing yourself in the pure female principle so industriously that you may lose sight of the individual on whom you're performing the act. Now, I've read a lot, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone make that point before. And it made me laugh, and yet it also was very wise. Here's another of my favorites, Malcolm de Chazal, Way Out There. And one of a kind. That's what I love. Some of the epigrammists are just way out there, eccentric, a solitary voice, and it's just amazing to me what they come up with. And I like to track them and then be in a conversation with them. All writing is a conversation, and with these epigrammists, clearly I'm reading them, and whether immediately or later, they're provoking me into a kind of response, and it's that back and forth that's such a richness. No writer creates the language by himself, and no writer creates a story without having read and heard so many other stories before.